I was 48 years old when my son reached into the drawer of my grief and took what was not his to take. Eleanor had been gone for 27 days. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand, the left arm slightly bent, because she always rested her face in her left hand when she read, and after 31 years, I had stopped noticing the habit until the glasses were the only thing left performing it. Her coffee cup was still in the drying rack beside the sink. I had washed it twice without thinking, the way you do a thing you have done 10,000 times, and both times I set it back in the rack, with the handle facing left the way she liked. I was not ready to put it in the cabinet. Putting it in the cabinet would mean something I was not yet prepared for it to mean. That was the condition of me at 48, a man who could not put a coffee cup away. Marcus came with Sandra for the funeral and stayed 3 days. Sandra moved through the rooms of the house the way a buyer moves through a property she has already decided to make an offer on, slowly, with her eyes going to the shelves and the surfaces and the dresser in the hallway. I registered this the way I register a watch running 4 seconds slow per day. I did not name what I was seeing. I filed it away and kept working. 3 weeks after the funeral, I opened Eleanor's jewelry box. The music mechanism, 8 bars of a waltz, the one she hummed in the kitchen without knowing she was doing it, played into the empty bedroom. The velvet interior was almost bare. The pearl bracelet was gone. The gold locket was gone. The sapphire ring she wore every day for 31 years, except when she was kneading bread dough, was gone. I stood there until the 8 bars finished. I closed the lid. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. That is how I am going to tell you this story. Not because I have forgotten how to feel, but because a man who has spent 38 years repairing the mechanisms inside things learns that the steadiest hand is the most useful one. The feelings were there. They were considerable. But they belong to me, and this story belongs to you. So I will give you the facts and let you feel what you need to feel. My name is Walter. I am 68 years old. I spent the better part of 4 decades in a workshop attached to the back of my house in a small town in Ohio, repairing timepieces, pocket watches, wristwatches, grandfather clocks, mantelpieces, antique jewelry boxes with small music mechanisms inside. I retired 11 years ago. My hands still reach for the lope out of habit when I examine something closely, even when it is not a watch movement, even when it is a receipt. 20 years after my son sold Eleanor's jewelry for $2,000, 4 days after her funeral, while I was still learning which drawer the coffee filters were in, because she had always been the one who knew, his daughter found the receipt. She was 19. She was home from her first year of college, helping me clear the spare room. She found it in a small tin I keep for parts I am not yet sure what to do with. She read it once, quietly. Then she read it again. Then she looked at me across the spare room with Eleanor's eyes. She has Eleanor's eyes, the same particular shade of gray-green that I spent 31 years looking into. And she said, "Grandpa, what is this?" What happened next took 72 hours and changed 4 lives. Before I tell you the next part, I want to tell you about the receipt itself, about the lamp I read it under, about the fold I put in it, precise and deliberate, the way you fold something you intend to keep, about the tin, and about a clockmaker's understanding of why certain things are worth preserving, even when you do not yet know exactly what they will be used for. 20 years is a long time to hold a part in reserve. It is not a long time for a clockmaker. Some of the movements I have repaired were 140 years old. The parts were still good. They had simply been waiting for someone who understood what they were. I understood what the receipt was. I just needed the right mechanism to arrive. That mechanism was 19 years old and had her grandmother's eyes, and she had been in the world for exactly as long as I had been keeping the tin. If you have ever had to hold something quietly for longer than anyone thought you should have to, hit the like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. There are more of us than any of us realized. Now, let me take you back to my workshop. The bench lamp cast its narrow cone of light across the movement I was working on. A pocket watch, mid-century, the mainspring fatigued from decades of overwinding by someone who had never learned the right amount of tension. People assume tighter is better. They wind and wind until there is no more give, and then they are surprised when the thing stops. You do not fix a mainspring by winding it harder. You fix it by understanding how much tension the mechanism was designed to hold, and then applying exactly that amount, and not one click more. Some things break by accident. A mainspring fatigues from age and use, and the slow friction of 1,000 ordinary days. A pivot wears to nothing through 100 years of simple, honest running. These are losses. They are sad, in the way that all endings are sad. They are not betrayals. Some things are taken apart deliberately, and a trained eye, a man who has spent 38 years looking at movements under a loupe in a good lamp, can always tell the difference. 20 years ago, someone took something apart deliberately. I noticed. I filed it away. And then I waited, with the patience of a man who has learned that some repairs cannot be rushed, for the right conditions to arrive. They arrived in the form of a 19-year-old girl, with a tin in her hands, and Eleanor's eyes, and a question she did not yet know the full weight of. We are going back to the beginning now, back to the workshop and the bench, and the morning and the clocks. I am going to tell you exactly what happened, in the order it happened, with the precision the story deserves. Because some things deserve to be held up to the light and examined carefully, the way you examine a hairline fracture in a watch movement, slowly, with a good lamp, without flinching from what you see. Eleanor deserved that. I owed her that much. I am going to pay that debt right now. The grandfather clock against the far wall of my workshop ticks in a slow, metronomic rhythm that I stopped hearing consciously sometime around 1987, the way people who live near train tracks stop hearing the trains. It is a Keininger movement, mid-century German, with a deadbeat escapement that I rebuilt from scratch 9 years ago, after the original anchor wore past the point of adjustment. The beat is exactly 1 second per swing. I know this not because I check it, but because after 38 years your body learns to keep time alongside the things you repair. My heartbeat has been slightly slower than average for most of my adult life. My doctor mentioned it once, with mild concern, and I explained that it was an occupational condition. He wrote something in my file and did not ask follow-up questions. I am sitting at my bench on a Tuesday morning in October, and the light through the single east-facing window is the particular pale gold of early autumn in Ohio. Not warm exactly, but honest. The kind of light that shows you things as they are, without flattering them. The movement on my bench is a pocket watch, Hamilton 992B, railroad grade, the mainspring fatigued from 40 years of overwinding, by a man who clearly loved the watch without fully understanding it. I can tell how a watch has been treated by the condition of its mainspring, the way a doctor can tell how a life has been lived by the condition of a man's heart. This one was wound tight every single day. You can see it in the set of the spring, the way it holds a curve even fully released. Something wound that tightly for that long does not simply go slack when you relieve the tension. It remembers. I am thinking about this when my granddaughter Lily walks into the workshop, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and the particular expression she gets when she is deciding whether to ask me something. She is 19. She has been home from her first year of college for 3 days, supposedly helping me clear the spare room, actually spending most of her time sitting on the stool beside my bench, asking me questions about watches and clocks, and how I got into the business, and why I got into it, and whether I ever regretted it. She has Eleanor's eyes. She has Eleanor's way of tilting her head slightly to the right when she is listening carefully, as if she is angling an ear toward something faint but worth hearing. She has Eleanor's silence, the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled and does not apologize for itself. I have not told her any of this. Some observations belong in the tin. She sets one coffee cup at the edge of my bench, far enough from the movement that I do not have to reposition anything. She learned that in the first hour on her first visit, 7 years ago, when she was 12, and knocked a balance wheel off the bench with her elbow and watched me spend 20 minutes finding it on the floor. She never crowded the bench again. She learns things once. She sits on the stool and wraps both hands around her own cup and watches me work. I said to her, "Your father used to sit on that stool." She said, "I know." "You've told me," I said. He had no patience for it. He would last about 4 minutes and then start fidgeting. She said, "That sounds about right." I set down the mainspring I was examining and picked up my coffee. The workshop was quiet in the way it is only in the morning, before the day accumulates its sounds. Outside, a car passed on the street. One of the mantel clocks on the shelf behind me chimed the quarter hour, a single soft note, like a question with no answer yet available. I want to tell you something about a clockmaker's relationship with time. Not the philosophical kind. Other people have said more than enough about that. I mean the practical kind. The kind that comes from spending 38 years as the person responsible for whether time runs correctly inside a given mechanism. A clockmaker does not experience time the way most people do. As a river, you are carried along by whether you like it or not. A clockmaker experiences time as a thing that can be calibrated, adjusted, corrected, a thing that requires maintenance, or it drifts. Left completely alone, even the finest movement in the world will gain or lose time. Precision requires attention. Without someone willing to do the work of keeping it accurate, even the best mechanism eventually tells the wrong story about what hour it is. 20 years ago, my son took something that could not be calibrated back. I was not ready to talk about that on the Tuesday morning in October when Lily sat on the stool. I was ready to drink my coffee and listen to the Keininger tick and think about mainsprings and the particular kind of damage that comes from being wound too tightly for too long. In 4 hours, everything would change. But clocks do not run on what is about to happen. They run on what is happening now, 1 second at a time, the anchor engaging the escapement wheel in a rhythm so consistent it becomes invisible. 1 second, 1 second, 1 second. I picked up the mainspring again. I went back to work. Eleanor died on a Wednesday in March, 20 years ago. She had been ill for 11 weeks. A short illness by some measures, though I am not sure what measure you would use to make 11 weeks feel short when they are the last 11 weeks. She died at 6:47 in the morning, which I know because I was sitting beside her bed and I looked at my watch when her breathing changed, the way a clockmaker looks at his watch. Not because I needed to know the time, because it was the thing my hands did. I will not tell you what those 11 weeks were like. You either know or you do not, and if you do not, I am not the one to explain it to you. I will tell you only what is relevant to the story, which is this. Eleanor was specific. She was a specific person. She wore the same sapphire ring every day for 31 years, except when she was kneading bread dough. She hummed 8 bars of a waltz in the kitchen, without knowing she was doing it. She read with her face in her left hand. She took her coffee with 1 sugar, and put the spoon in the saucer, not the cup, because she said a spoon left in the cup made a sound that bothered her every time she set it down. These are not small details. These are the mechanisms. These are the things that kept her running. After she died, the house ran on the mechanisms without her. The reading glasses kept being bent in the left arm from a hand that was no longer there to bend them. The coffee cup kept sitting in the drying rack because I kept washing it, and putting it back because I could not do anything else with it. The spoon went in the saucer. Everything went in the places she had established for it. Over 31 years of running the house, with the quiet authority of a woman who knew where things belonged and had arranged them accordingly. I did not move anything. Moving things would mean starting the process of finding out what the house was, without her in it. and I was not ready for that information. Marcus and Sandra arrived the day before the funeral, and stayed 4 days. They came in through the front door, and Sandra went through the rooms first, ahead of Marcus, ahead of me, the way a person does when they are looking for something. I noticed this. I did not name it. I had a great deal to manage in those 4 days, and naming the thing I was noticing in Sandra's eyes when she looked at the bedroom dresser was not at the top of the list. I want to describe what Sandra looked like moving through a room, because I think it matters. She was a woman of precise and careful appetites. She knew what she wanted, and she moved toward it with a deliberateness that she wore as confidence. She was 20 years old that week. She had been with Marcus for 2 years. She had never, in 2 years, come to the house without her eyes going to the things in it and taking a kind of inventory. I had noticed this before. I had chalked it up to the natural curiosity of a young person in someone else's house. Standing in my hallway 3 days after Eleanor died, watching Sandra's eyes move from the dresser to the jewelry box visible through the open bedroom door, I revised that assessment slightly. I filed it away in the same place I filed everything I was not yet ready to name, the back of the workbench of my mind, under the lamp I would eventually turn toward it. I went to make arrangements. The funeral was on a Friday. There were 47 people in the church. I counted them the way I count things, automatically, without deciding to. The minister said things about Eleanor that were true, but not specific enough to be really true. The way a description of a watch that says it is round and gold describes the watch without capturing it. Eleanor deserved better specifics. I thought about standing up and providing them. I did not stand up. I sat in the front pew with my hands folded and listened to the not quite right description of the woman I had spent 31 years learning to read. Marcus sat beside me. He cried, which was genuine. Whatever Marcus was and was not, his grief that day was real. I knew it was real, because I had spent 38 years learning the difference between things that run correctly and things that are performing correctly. A watch that is performing correctly looks fine from the outside. A watch that runs correctly sounds different. Marcus sounded right that day, which is to say he sounded like a man who had just lost his mother, which he had. Sandra sat beside Marcus and held his hand and stared at the minister with the attentive expression of a person who is present in the way that earns credit for being present. After the funeral there was food at the house. People said kind things about Eleanor and ate casserole. I stood in the kitchen for most of it, near the drying rack, near the cup with the handle facing left. A woman from Eleanor's book club told me that Eleanor had talked about me every week for 11 years. She said Eleanor called me her watchman. She said it the way people repeat a sweet thing, not knowing whether it means as much as it sounds like it should mean. It meant exactly as much as it sounded like it should mean. Marcus and Sandra left on Sunday morning. I walked them to the car. Sandra hugged me with the particular efficiency of someone completing a necessary gesture. Marcus hugged me for longer than that, and his shoulders were still doing the thing that meant he was trying not to come apart, and I held on until they stopped. I watched the car until it turned at the end of the street. I went back inside. I washed Eleanor's coffee cup. I put it in the drying rack with the handle facing left. I went to the workshop and sat at the bench, and did not pick anything up for a long time. The grandfather clock ticked against the far wall. The mantel clock on the second shelf chimed the quarter hour. A bracket clock near the door answered it 3 seconds later, with a slightly different tone, the way a conversation answers itself when no one new has anything to add. I sat there until it was dark. Then I went to bed. The jewelry box was on the dresser. I did not open it. I was not ready to open it. Some mechanisms you approach slowly, when you have the right tools and the right light and the steadiness of hand that the job requires. I was not yet steady enough. I would be. I had learned, over 38 years, that steadiness is not a permanent condition. It is something you return to. It comes back, the way a pendulum returns to center after each swing, as long as the mechanism is sound. The mechanism was sound. I just needed time. Time, at least, was something I understood how to work with. The jewelry box had sat on Eleanor's dresser for the entire length of our marriage, 31 years, 4 months, and 17 days, though I did not count the days until after. It was a mahogany box, perhaps 8 inches wide and 5 inches deep, with a small brass hinge at the back and a clasp at the front that had grown slightly loose over the years from the particular way Eleanor opened it. Her thumb under the clasp, a quick upward press, the lid swinging back on the hinge with a motion she had performed so many thousands of times that she no longer looked at her hands while she did it. She did it the way I wind a mainspring, by feel, by habit, by the accumulated memory of 10,000 repetitions. The music mechanism was inside the lid, a small cylinder and comb movement, 18 notes, that played 8 bars of a waltz when the lid reached a certain angle. Eleanor had never told me the name of the waltz. I had never thought to ask. After she died, I spent the better part of an afternoon trying to identify it by humming it into my telephone, which produced results I will not dignify by reporting. It was simply the waltz, the one she hummed in the kitchen. The one I heard every morning for 31 years and stopped hearing, the way you stop hearing a clock, until it was the only sound in the room. 3 weeks after the funeral, on a Saturday morning in April, I went into the bedroom to change the batteries in the smoke alarm above the dresser. This required standing on the step stool Eleanor had kept in the closet for exactly this purpose, because she had handled the smoke alarm batteries herself every March for the entire duration of our marriage. She was 5 feet 4 inches, and I am 6 feet 1 inch, and she used the step stool anyway, because she did not like asking for help with things she could manage herself. This was a fact about Eleanor that I had accepted early and never challenged. Some mechanisms run better when you do not interfere with them. I stood on the step stool and changed the batteries. I stepped down. I was putting the step stool back in the closet when I stopped. The jewelry box was on the dresser directly in front of me, and something about the angle of the morning light through the window, that particular pale Ohio spring light that comes in low and sideways and shows you things, made the box look wrong, lighter than usual, the way a watch case looks after you have removed the movement. Still the right shape, wrong weight. I put the step stool away. I picked up the box. I pressed my thumb under the clasp the way she had pressed it 10,000 times, and the lid swung back on the hinge, and 8 bars of a waltz played into the empty bedroom. The velvet interior was almost bare. Almost. There were 3 items remaining out of the 14 that I knew had been there. I knew the count because a clockmaker inventories things, because the habit of cataloging what is present is inseparable from the habit of noting what is absent. A pair of clip-on earrings in yellow gold, costume, not valuable, that Eleanor had worn to a cousin's wedding in 1994, and then never again. A brooch shaped like a dragonfly, with paste stones that had been her mother's, the stones cloudy, and one of them chipped at the edge. A thin silver bangle, tarnished nearly black, that had been in the box since before I knew her, and whose origin she had never fully explained. The items that remained were the items that anyone who knew nothing about jewelry would leave behind. The items that remained were the ones that looked old and minor. The items that remained were the ones that had no obvious market value to an eye that was looking for obvious market value. The pearl bracelet was gone. The gold locket was gone. The sapphire ring was gone. I stood there, and the waltz finished its 8 bars, and the mechanism stilled, and I did not move. The clock on the bedroom wall ticked. The morning light shifted incrementally, the way spring light does, slowly warming as the sun climbed. Somewhere outside, a bird was making a noise in the maple tree. I registered all of this information the way I register information, without deciding to, without choosing, the way a movement registers the swing of its pendulum. I let the silence stretch. Then I closed the lid. I set the box back on the dresser, precisely in the rectangle of slightly less faded wood where it had sat for 31 years. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I put Eleanor's cup in the drying rack with the handle facing left, because I still could not put it in the cabinet. I sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee and looked at the window. The sapphire ring. She had worn it on her right hand, middle finger, every day for the entirety of our marriage. She had taken it off to knead bread dough because she did not like the feeling of dough packing under the setting, and she had always put it on the windowsill above the sink while she kneaded. And one time, in 1993, I had walked into the kitchen and seen it sitting there on the windowsill, and felt, for a moment I cannot fully account for, a cold and specific fear, because for a fraction of a second my mind processed the absence of the ring from her hand, before it processed the bread dough and the flour, and the perfectly ordinary explanation. That is how embedded it was. My mind categorized that ring as part of her, and its absence as a signal that something was wrong. Its absence was now permanent, and the signal was confirmed. Something was wrong. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I did not know yet what the next step was. A clockmaker learns early that the wrong tool applied too quickly can damage a mechanism beyond what the original problem would have done. You assess first. You identify the fault. You understand the full scope of what you are dealing with before you pick up anything. I washed my coffee cup. I went to the workshop. I sat at the bench and picked up the movement I was working on. A mantel clock, French, early 20th century. The platform escapement gummed with old oil that had turned to varnish over the decades, and I worked on it for 4 hours without stopping. The jewelry box kept being empty. The clock on the bedroom wall kept ticking. The coffee cup stayed in the drying rack. I worked. I did not yet know what I was going to do. I just knew that a trained eye had seen the damage, and that the damage was not an accident. I called Marcus on a Sunday, 3 days after I found the empty box. I had spent those 3 days working in the workshop, with the particular focused calm of a man who is using the work to keep himself calibrated, the way you keep a regulator clock calibrated. Small adjustments, constant attention, nothing dramatic. I had eaten breakfast each morning at the kitchen table. I had made Eleanor's coffee cup every morning and put it in the drying rack when I was done. I had slept 6 hours each night, which was approximately what I slept before Eleanor died, and approximately what I have slept since, because my body has always been indifferent to the idea that sleep requirements change with circumstances. I called Marcus on a Sunday, and I asked him, with the conversational tone of a man making routine inquiry, whether Sandra might have moved some of Eleanor's jewelry somewhere for safekeeping. I want to be precise about why I asked it that way. I had 38 years of experience examining things under a loupe before deciding what I was looking at. I was not yet certain of what I was looking at. What I had was an empty jewelry box, and a memory of Sandra's eyes moving across the bedroom doorway, and an absence where 3 specific items had been. What I did not yet have was evidence. A clockmaker does not name the fault until he can demonstrate the fault. He notes what is missing. He traces the movement of the parts. He establishes the sequence. Then he names the fault. So I asked Marcus, with a casual tone, whether Sandra might have moved some of Eleanor's jewelry somewhere for safekeeping. There was a pause before he answered. Not a long pause, perhaps 2 seconds, but a practiced pause. The pause of a man who has prepared an answer and is giving himself a moment to locate it. I know a rehearsed response, the way I know a watch that has been wound too tight, by the feel of it before it moves. Marcus said, "Oh, Sandra mentioned she put some things somewhere safe. She didn't want anything to happen to them. I can ask her where she put them." I said, "That would be helpful." He said, "Sure, I'll ask her." I said, "The sapphire ring especially. I'd like to know where that is." He said, "Yeah, of course. I'll find out." His voice had the quality of a mechanism that is running, but not running correctly. Most people would not hear it. Most people listen to the words. I listen to the movement, the speed, the tension, the particular quality of a response that is producing its output too smoothly, as if it has been rehearsed to the point where the natural friction has been polished away. A genuine response has friction. A genuine response includes the small hesitations and self-corrections of a mind actually working. Marcus's response had no friction. It was too smooth. It had been prepared. I said, "Thank you. How are you and Sandra doing?" He said, "Fine. Good. Really good, actually. Sandra just started a new job." I said, "That's good news. Tell her congratulations from me." He said, "I will. I'll ask her about the jewelry." I said, "No rush." I said no rush, because there was, in fact, no rush. What was gone was gone. I already understood that. What I was doing was not retrieving. What I was doing was something a clockmaker understands instinctively. I was making a diagnosis. I was establishing what had happened, and when, and how, with the precision required by the situation, before I decided what tool to pick up. We said goodbye. I set down the telephone. I went to the workshop. I picked up the French mantel clock I had been working on, and held it under the bench lamp, and looked at the platform escapement, and thought about the two types of broken things. Things that break by accident, and things that are taken apart deliberately, by someone who knows what they are taking and why. The platform escapement was gummed with old oil. That was age. That was not anyone's fault. It would clean and it would run. That was a different category of problem from the one I was now holding in my mind, turning it under the lamp. Marcus had answered too smoothly. He had used the right words in the right order, and the words had come out without friction, and that frictionless smoothness was the tell. The tell in a watch is always in the rhythm. The tell in a person is the same. I set the mantel clock down. I went back to the house. I stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment and looked at the jewelry box on the dresser. The afternoon light had changed. The box sat in shadow now, the brass clasp catching a small point of light from the hallway. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I put the spoon in the saucer. I waited. Some repairs require waiting. It is one of the things that separates a trained technician from an impatient one. The understanding that intervening before you have the full diagnosis can cause damage that exceeds the original fault. Some diagnostics require allowing the mechanism to run a little further before you intervene, so you can observe the full pattern of the fault and not just the symptom it presents on the surface. I was not certain yet of the full pattern. I needed one more look. I needed to get below the surface of what I was seeing and find the part that had actually failed, and the sequence in which the failure had occurred. That part arrived 6 months later, in the breast pocket of a jacket Marcus had left hanging on the hook in the spare room the last time he visited. Some things find their way to the right lamp eventually. You just have to give them enough time. 6 months after the funeral, a Wednesday in September, the first cool morning of the season, the kind of morning where the light through the workshop window has shifted from the flat white of summer to something thinner and more considered. I was sorting through the spare room. I had been putting off the spare room since Eleanor died. It held, among other things, a collection of Marcus's things from various points of his life that had accumulated in our house the way water accumulates in a low spot, naturally, without anyone deciding it should happen. A milk crate of records from his early 20s, a box of school drawings and reports in Eleanor's handwriting on the labels, a canvas duffel bag from a fishing trip he had taken with me in 1998, 3 jackets on hooks behind the door, the oldest of which was a brown corduroy he had worn through most of high school and left here at 18 and never retrieved, which I had kept without knowing quite why. I took the jackets down from the hooks. I checked the pockets the way you check pockets before laundering, automatically, without particular expectation. The corduroy jacket gave me a movie ticket stub from 1994, and a guitar pick, and a stick of gum so old it had calcified into something resembling a small piece of chalk. The second jacket, a windbreaker from the early 2000s, gave me a gas station receipt and 2 rubber bands. The third jacket, a dark wool blazer, relatively recent, the one Marcus had worn to Eleanor's funeral, and then left on the hook during his last visit 6 months ago. I checked the breast pocket last. The receipt was folded in half. Then, in half again. The kind of folding that is not careless, not crumpled, not forgotten. Folded the way you fold something you intend to revisit. Or perhaps the way you fold something you want to compress into the smallest possible version of itself, as if reducing its dimensions reduces what it represents. I unfolded it under the bench lamp. The bench lamp is a Waldman, adjustable, 5,000 Kelvin, the same color temperature as overcast daylight, which is what a watchmaker needs when examining the surfaces of small things for hairline fractures. Under that lamp I have read the condition of a 100-year-old pivot worn to less than half a millimeter. I have read the marks of a mainspring that fatigued and snapped and left scored lines on the inside of the case. I have read things too small to see without the loop, too significant to ignore. I read the receipt without the loop. The type was clear enough. County Pawn and Exchange, 1147 Route 40 East, dated April 7th, 4 days after Eleanor's funeral. 3 items listed: pearl bracelet, 7-inch, 14K gold clasp, $480. Gold locket, 18K, oval, engraved, $620. Sapphire ring, 14K, oval cut, approx. 1.2 CT, $900. Total paid to customer, $2,000. I read it once. I read it again. I read it a third time, the way I read an inscription on a watch movement that I am not certain I have read correctly. Not because the words are unclear, but because the meaning of the words requires a moment to settle into its full shape. The sapphire ring, approximately 1.2 carats, oval cut, in a 14-carat setting. The ring she had worn every day for 31 years except when she was kneading bread dough. The ring I had watched her put on and take off 10,000 times. The ring whose absence had already told me what I needed to know, 6 months before I had the document that confirmed it. 4 days after her funeral. She had been in the ground for 4 days. I let the silence stretch. I did not fold the receipt back the way it came. I folded it myself. Once, precisely along a new crease. Then again, perpendicular to the first fold. A clean fold. A watchmaker's fold. I held it for a moment under the lamp, this small square of paper that contained the arithmetic of what my son had done. Then I went to the shelf above my bench, where I keep a collection of small tins, the kind with friction-fit lids, used for storing watch parts too small to leave loose, springs, pins, setting levers, things too important to discard and too small to keep track of without a container. I selected a tin. I placed the receipt inside. I pressed the lid down until it seated with a soft click. I set the tin on the shelf. Then I went back to the spare room and finished taking down the jackets. I put the corduroy and the windbreaker in a bag for the donation box. I put the wool blazer back on its hook because it was expensive and not mine to dispose of. I sorted through the milk crate of records and found 2 that had been Eleanor's and set them aside. I worked through the box of school drawings. Marcus at 7, drawing a house with 4 windows and a sun with 8 rays, his name written in the top corner in Eleanor's hand. Marcus, age 7. I put the drawings back in the box in the same order I found them and replaced the lid. I worked until the spare room was sorted. Then I went to the workshop and sat at the bench and did not pick anything up for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I was watching the sweep hand of the Hamilton on the bench. Some information changes the weight of everything in the room. The tin on the shelf weighed the same as it had before I opened the receipt. The laws of physics are not altered by what a man knows. But the room had a different quality to it now, the way a room has a different quality when you have finally identified the fault in a mechanism you have been trying to diagnose. Not relief, not resolution, simply the particular stillness of a thing understood. I did not call Marcus. I did not drive to the pawn shop on Route 40 East. I was 48 years old, and I understood something that a younger man might not have. That information held with patience is worth considerably more than information used in anger. The jewelry was gone. It would still be gone whether I called Marcus that afternoon, or whether I waited until I knew exactly what I intended to do with what I knew. I picked up the Hamilton pocket watch. I went back to work. The tin sat on the shelf above the bench for the next 20 years. I was aware of it the way you are aware of a clock in a room, without turning to look at it. Because your body has catalogued it. Because your internal sense of the space includes it. Present. Keeping its own kind of time. Some parts wait years to find the right mechanism. That is not waste. That is patience. I kept working. The tin kept waiting. Here is what 20 years looks like from the inside of a workshop. It looks like 6,000 mornings at the bench. It looks like the Hamilton 992B repaired and delivered, and another movement in its place on the felt mat, and then another after that, and another after that, until the accumulated weight of 38 years of work settles into something that has no single representative image, just the lamp, and the loop, and the slow particular satisfaction of a thing made to run again. I kept working through all of it. That is the truth of the 20 years, stated plainly. Some men would have drunk or raged or fallen into the kind of dissolution that announces itself as grief, and is partly grief and partly the relief of having a reason to stop functioning. I did not drink, I did not rage. I got up every morning and went to the bench and worked on whatever needed working on until it ran. This is not heroism. It is what you do when you have 38 years of practice at fixing things. Marcus and Sandra married in May, 14 months after Eleanor's funeral, in a small ceremony I attended, wearing the same dark suit I had worn to the funeral, and trying not to calculate the interval. They were 23 and 21. Sandra wore a dress that had cost more than the dress Eleanor had worn at our wedding, though that observation is perhaps unfair to make, given that 23 years of inflation existed between the two events. I stood in the third row and watched my son marry the woman who had stood in my hallway, with her eyes moving across the bedroom doorway, and I said the right things at the reception, and I shook the right hands, and I drove home at 10 in the evening and went to the workshop and sat at the bench and did not pick anything up. The tin was on the shelf. It had been on the shelf for 14 months. Lily was born 11 months after the wedding, which is to say she arrived in April, which is to say she was born in the same month of the year as her grandmother's funeral, and her grandfather's discovery of the empty jewelry box, and the visit to the pawn shop on Route 40 East. April is a month I have a complicated relationship with. Lily has, without knowing this, always been the part of April I am glad arrived. When Lily was 3, Marcus called to ask whether I could take her for a while. A few weeks, he said. Maybe a month or two. Sandra's mother was ill, and they were managing a great deal at once, and they thought having one fewer thing to arrange might help. Lily came for 2 months. She stayed for 4 years. I did not know, when I drove to Columbus and put Lily in the car seat in the back of my truck and drove home, that 4 years was the answer to the question of how long. I knew 2 months. I built my life around 2 months. And then at the end of 2 months, Marcus called and said they needed a little more time. And I said, of course. And that is how it happens. Not in one large decision, but in a series of small extensions, each one reasonable on its own. Until you look up, and 4 years have passed, and the child in the spare room is 7 years old, and falls asleep each night to the grandfather clock ticking in the workshop below, and has learned to tell time on an analog clock, because you believe everyone should know how to read the hands. I taught her to tell time, sitting at the kitchen table, with a wooden clock face that had movable hands, a teaching tool, purchased at the toy store in town for $7.95. She learned it in 11 days. I could tell she liked the sessions, so I let the remaining time run at her pace, and we talked about other things while she moved the hands to the times I called out. Those mornings at the kitchen table are among the clearest things I carry from those 4 years. Not because anything particular was said, because she sat across from me with Eleanor's eyes and moved the hands of the clock with the concentrated focus of a child who wants to get a thing right, and the grandfather clock ticked below, and the morning was quiet. At 7, Lily went back to her parents. Marcus had stabilized. New job, steadier footing. I drove her to Columbus on a Saturday in June and helped carry her things up to her room, which Sandra had repainted yellow while Lily was away. Lily stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. She set her backpack on the bed and looked at me. I said, "I'll see you at Christmas." She said, "Promise?" I said, "I promise." She picked up her backpack and began unpacking it into the yellow room with the methodical focus of a child who has learned to manage transitions. She was 7 years old. She had Eleanor's eyes and Eleanor's way of handling things. Without asking for help, she could manage herself. I drove back to Ohio. I went to the workshop. The tin was on the shelf. It had been on the shelf for 7 years and 2 months. I picked up the movement I was working on and worked until I could not see the hands clearly in the lamplight. 20 years, 6,000 mornings. One granddaughter with Eleanor's eyes. One tin on a shelf. The mechanism was still running. It was simply waiting for the right conditions. They were 11 years away. There are things that break in a family that no one talks about for years. Not because there is nothing to say, because the people who know the full shape of what happened have made a private calculation that saying it now, before the right moment, would cost more than it would recover. So they carry it. They put it in a tin and set it on a shelf and go back to work. And sometimes it takes a young person with fresh eyes to finally pick up the broken piece and ask, "What was this part of?" If you have ever watched someone you love carry something that was not theirs to carry, hit the like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. I want to know how many of us there are. The spare room had not been fully cleared since Eleanor died. I want to be precise about this, because it is the kind of statement that sounds like neglect, and is not quite that. The room had been used. It had been Lily's room for 4 years, and I had maintained it during those years. Clean sheets, working lamp, the small bookshelf I had assembled from a kit the week before she arrived, which held the books she accumulated during the 4 years, and which still held them now, 12 years later, because I had not moved them after she left, and had not developed a reason to. The room had been the spare room in every functional sense since she went back to Columbus. It simply had not been sorted. There is a difference, in a house where one person has lived alone for many years, between rooms that are kept and rooms that are sorted. Kept means clean, functional, maintained. Sorted means the decision has been made about what belongs and what does not. Some rooms I had sorted in the years after Eleanor died. The bedroom, eventually, and the kitchen, and the living room. The bedroom took 3 years. I am not reporting this as a confession. I am reporting it as a fact about the pace at which certain decisions can be made without forcing them. When I finally sorted the bedroom, and by sorted I mean moved Eleanor's reading glasses into the nightstand drawer, put her coffee cup in the cabinet, placed her books in a box and carried the box to the spare room, I did it on a Tuesday morning in February, in the gray light of an Ohio winter, and it took 3 hours and I did not rush any of it. When it was done, I stood in the doorway and looked at the room, which looked now like a room where one person slept, and I went to the workshop and picked up a mantel clock that needed cleaning and worked on it until supper. The spare room had remained in a state of kept without being sorted, which meant it contained, still, the milk crate of Marcus's records, the box of school drawings with Eleanor's handwriting on the label, and the 3 hooks behind the door where Marcus's jackets had hung, until I took 2 of them down in September 20 years ago and left the wool blazer. The wool blazer was still there. I had not decided what to do with it. Some things you leave on the hook until the question answers itself. Lily arrived on a Thursday in October, the same October, 3 days before the morning she found me in the workshop with the Hamilton mainspring. She had offered, in a phone call the week before, to help me sort the spare room. I had said yes without pausing to think carefully about what the spare room contained, which was either careless of me or the kind of readiness that does not announce itself as readiness until afterward. We worked in companionable quiet for most of the morning. Lily has always had the quality I most value in a workshop assistant. She asked, before moving anything she was uncertain about. She was not afraid of dust, and she did not require background noise to fill the silence. She is 19 years old, and she does not need the radio. I find this remarkable. Most people her age are uncomfortable with silence, the way most people are uncomfortable standing in a room where a clock has stopped. They feel it as an absence that needs addressing. Lily feels silence as a condition. She works in it the way I work in it, with the understanding that the absence of noise is not the absence of information. She sorted through the milk crate of Marcus's records systematically, not pulling things out randomly, but working from one end to the other, examining each sleeve, making a considered decision before setting it in one pile or the other. She had brought a canvas bag from the car, anticipating she might find things worth keeping. She filled a third of it with records before moving to the next box. She works the way I work. She does not know she does this. I have never pointed it out, for the same reason I have never told her she has Eleanor's eyes, because some observations are worth more kept than spoken. She found the box of school drawings and went still for a moment when she saw Eleanor's handwriting on the label. She opened the lid carefully, as if the handwriting on the outside meant the contents required a particular kind of handling. She spent 20 minutes going through them, which I had anticipated, because Lily has always been the kind of person who reads every document she encounters. She holds things up to the light. She turns them over. She gives things the time they are owed. She found the drawing Marcus had made at 7. The house with 4 windows and a sun with 8 rays. The crayon application heavy and enthusiastic. His name written in the corner, in Eleanor's careful print. Marcus, age 7. She held it up to show me. She said, "He's always been a terrible artist." I said, "He tried very hard." She said, "That's the nicest possible interpretation of this drawing, Grandpa." I said, "I am a very nice man." She laughed, a short, clear sound, Eleanor's laugh, the same particular rhythm of it, and set the drawing back in the box with care. She replaced the lid and moved the box to the keeping pile, and went on sorting. I was working on a different section of the room, a stack of boxes near the window that contained clock parts I had moved from the workshop during a reorganization in 2009, and never moved back. Springs wrapped in tissue paper, escapement wheels in small labeled envelopes. A cuckoo clock mechanism I had repaired for a customer who moved away without collecting it, which I had kept for 11 years, in the expectation they would return. An expectation I had not yet revised, though 11 years is perhaps longer than reasonable expectation typically runs. Lily worked her way through 2 more boxes. She found a set of Marcus's old school books and asked whether I wanted them. I said no. She found a box of Eleanor's kitchen things that had been stored up here, serving dishes, a gravy boat still in its original box from 1989, and carried them downstairs without asking, because they were clearly kitchen items, and the kitchen was clearly where they belonged. She came back up with the quiet expression of a person who has accomplished a small thing correctly and is ready for the next. I was examining the cuckoo mechanism under the window light, turning it to check the condition of the bellows, when the thought arrived the way workshop thoughts arrive, not announced, simply present. I had been in this room with Lily for 3 hours. We had sorted through the accumulated evidence of Marcus's life, from age 7 through 22, and I had not thought about the tin once. That absence of thought was itself a kind of information. A man who spends 20 years keeping a thing in his peripheral awareness does not simply stop being aware of it. He stops being aware of it when the situation has changed in some way he has not yet consciously identified. I set the cuckoo mechanism down and looked across the room at Lily's back. Her dark hair, Eleanor's particular way of holding her shoulders when she is concentrating, and thought, The spare room is being sorted. The boxes are being opened. The things that have been waiting in this room are being found. I picked the mechanism back up. I went back to examining the bellows. I heard Lily go quiet. She had been providing a low, steady commentary on what she was finding. The occasional observation, the question about what something was, the soft sound when she found something that surprised her. The commentary stopped, not suddenly. It simply ceased to continue, the way a clock does not stop abruptly when the mainspring runs down. It slows, incrementally, until there is a last tick, and then there is not, and for a moment, you are not certain exactly when the stopping happened. I looked across the room. She was holding the tin. She had found it in the box that had held Marcus's school drawings. The same box I had replaced the drawings into 20 years ago, before setting the tin inside, without much thought about where the tin ended up, or perhaps with precisely the thought that this box, labeled in Eleanor's handwriting, was the right container for something waiting 20 years to be found by the right person. Lily held the tin in both hands, the lid off, the receipt unfolded and flat. She read it with the same stillness she had brought to the clock face sessions at the kitchen table when she was 3, concentrated, unhurried, giving the information the full time it required to settle. She was not skimming. She read every line. County Pawn and Exchange, 1147 Route 40 East, April 7th. Pearl bracelet, 14K gold clasp, $480. Gold locket, 18K. Oval, engraved, $620. Sapphire ring, 14K. Oval cut, approx. 1.2 CT, $900. Total paid to customer, $2,000. She read it once. She was quiet. She read it again. I set down the cuckoo mechanism and waited. She looked up at me across the spare room. Eleanor's eyes, in the particular quality of October light through the window, that thin, honest light that shows things plainly, had a gray quality I recognized. Not grief. The expression of a person who is in the process of revising something they thought they understood, finding that the revision requires considerably more room than the original version had occupied. She held the tin toward me, not to return it, but to show me she had found it. The way you present to someone a part removed from a mechanism you cannot yet place. She said, "Grandpa, what is this?" I let the silence run for 3 full seconds. Outside, a car passed on the street. The grandfather clock ticked in the workshop below, steady and even, and reliable, the way it had ticked through everything since I rebuilt the escapement 9 years ago. The light shifted slightly across the floor as a cloud moved outside the window. The tin sat in her hands, the receipt inside it, folded along the crease I had made 20 years ago under the bench lamp, the watchmaker's fold, precise and deliberate, the fold of a man who knew he was keeping something. I said, "Come downstairs. I'll make coffee." She nodded once. She folded the receipt along the crease. She found it naturally, the paper knowing where it wanted to close, and placed it back in the tin and pressed the lid down until it clicked. She carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table between us. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, the way Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup on cold mornings. The cup held close, the warmth used. Lily did not know she was doing this. I looked at my hands flat on the table. The same hands that had repaired thousands of movements across 38 years, that had held Eleanor's hand through 11 weeks of illness, that had signed Lily's school permission slips for 4 years, field trips, consent forms, the small accumulated paperwork of a child's life passing through your kitchen. That had folded that receipt under the bench lamp 20 years ago, and placed it in the tin with a soft click I had known, even at 48, was not an ending. It was a pause, a component held in reserve for the mechanism that had not yet arrived. The mechanism was sitting across from me with her grandmother's eyes, and the tin between her hands. The coffee was hot. The clock ticked below. I began to tell her. I have repaired thousands of mechanisms in my life. I have taken apart things that were broken and understood them down to the last component, and put them back together, in the correct order, and returned them to their owners running correctly. I have done this for 38 years, with the patient precision that the work requires. But I have only explained what Marcus did to 2 people in 20 years. Myself, in the workshop, under the lamp, the night I read the receipt, and Lily, at the kitchen table, on a Thursday morning in October, with the tin between us and the coffee cooling slowly in our cups. I want to tell you what that looked like. Not what was said, exactly, but how it was said, because the how is the part that matters. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I told her the way I would read a repair log to a customer who had brought me a movement I had just finished, plainly, in sequence, with the specifics that make a thing comprehensible. I told her about the jewelry box, about the 3 items that had been there and then were not, about the 8 bars of waltz playing into the empty room, about the phone call with Marcus and the rehearsed smoothness of his answer, the way a response without friction tells you exactly as much as a response with it. I told her about the jacket, about the breast pocket, about the Waldman lamp and the 3 lines on the receipt and the fold I put in it before I placed it in the tin. I told her how much they sold it for, $2,000, 4 days after Eleanor's funeral. Lily's hands stayed flat on the table through most of it. She did not reach for her coffee. She did not look away from me. She has Eleanor's quality of attention, the kind that makes you feel, when it is directed at you, that what you are saying is being received in full, not just the parts that are easy to hold. Eleanor used to sit exactly this way when I was telling her something that mattered, hands flat, eyes steady, the full weight of her attention on the thing being said. When I finished talking, the kitchen was quiet, except for the clock ticking below in the workshop. Lily looked at the tin for a long moment. Then she looked back at me. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, 20 years. She said, "And you kept it in the tin?" I said, "I wasn't sure what the right moment was." I said, "And then you found it, so I suppose the tin knew better than I did." She was quiet again for a long time. I did not fill the silence. A man who has spent 38 years in a workshop learns that silence is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be allowed. Lily understands this. She sat with the silence the way she sits with everything, steadily, without agitation, giving it the room it needed. Then she said, "Did he know what that ring meant to you?" I thought about this carefully, the way I think about a diagnosis before I name it. I said, "Your father knew what he was doing." I said, "I believe he has known every day for 20 years what he did. Whether that is the same thing as understanding what it meant, I couldn't tell you." She picked up the tin. She looked at it the way I look at a movement I am deciding how to approach, measuring the gap between what I know and what I need to know before I act. She said, "I need to talk to him." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to drive to Columbus today." I said, "I know that too." She set the tin back on the table between us. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway, the way you finish something because finishing it is the right thing to do. She stood up. She carried both cups to the sink. She rinsed them. She put them in the drying rack with a care and precision that had nothing to do with the cups. She said, "Grandpa." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad I found it." I looked at my hands on the table. Then I looked at her. I said, "I believe it was ready to be found." She left 20 minutes later. I watched her car until it turned at the end of the street, the same way I had watched Marcus and Sandra's car turn at the end of the street 20 years ago, and then come back inside and washed Eleanor's coffee cup and put it in the drying rack. 2 different turns. 2 completely different things waiting at the end of them. I went to the workshop. I sat at the bench and did not pick anything up immediately. I sat and listened to the grandfather clock and thought about the texture of that morning. Lily's laugh at Marcus's drawing, the tin in her hands, the flatness of her attention while I told her, the way she rinsed those cups with the steadiness of a person holding herself together by attending to something small. Then I picked up the Hamilton and went back to work. Some repairs require time after the diagnostic phase. You identify the fault, you name it, you let the knowledge settle before you decide which tool to pick up. I had identified the fault 20 years ago. I had named it to Lily this morning. The tool was now in motion. The clock ticked. The afternoon light shifted from pale gold to the longer orange of early evening. I thought about Eleanor. I noticed that Lily had taken the tin with her when she left. She had picked it up quietly, without asking, with the authority of someone who knows a document belongs with the person who intends to use it. She was right. Some parts belong with the mechanism they are meant to complete. Lily drove the 2 hours to Columbus in the afternoon and arrived at Marcus and Sandra's house at 4:17. I know the time because she texted me from the driveway before she went in. Here. She is precise about these things. She always has been. I do not know everything that happened in that house between 4:17 and 6:40, when she texted me again. I was not there. What I know is what she told me afterward, and I will give it to you the way she gave it to me, factually, without embellishment, in the language of a person who has her grandfather's way of reporting things. Marcus answered the door. Sandra was in the kitchen behind him, visible through the hallway. Lily walked in and went to the kitchen table, the same instinct, the kitchen table, and set the tin down and took the receipt out and placed it flat on the table. She sat down. She waited until Marcus came to the table. Sandra came to stand in the doorway of the kitchen. Lily looked at Marcus. She said, "Did you know what that ring meant to him?" She did not say, "I found this." She did not say, "How could you?" She asked the one question that cut below the surface of the event to the thing underneath it, whether Marcus understood, at the moment of selling, what he was taking. Not just from the jewelry box, from his father. Marcus looked at the receipt on the table. His face went still, not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of a man who has seen something he thought was safely buried arrive on the surface in broad daylight. His posture changed. The particular lean he had when he was feeling the advantage of a situation went out of him completely, the way air goes out of something when the seal fails. He sat down at the table across from Lily. He did not look at Sandra. Sandra came into the kitchen fully. She moved toward the table with the purposeful forward momentum of a woman preparing to manage the situation. She began to speak. She said, "Lily, there are things you don't understand about what was happening at the time." She said, "We were in a very difficult position financially, and the decision was made under a lot of pressure." She said the word desperate. She said the words had to. Lily looked at her. One look, steady and even, and without heat. The way the bench lamp is steady and without heat. Its usefulness is in the clarity of the light, not the temperature of it. Sandra stopped talking. Lily looked back at Marcus. She said, "You had a job." She let the silence run. Then she said, "The word desperate doesn't mean what you think it means when you're choosing between your father's grief and your rent." Marcus did not argue. He looked at the receipt for a long time. His hands were on the table, and they were doing the thing that Marcus's hands always did when he was cornered by something true, moving slightly, repositioning, as if looking for something to hold. Sandra's hands, by contrast, were still at her sides, two different kinds of response to the same situation, one adjusting to it, one waiting for an angle. Eventually Marcus said, "Yes," he said, "I knew what I was doing." He said, "I have known every day." He said, "I needed the money. Not to be malicious. I needed it." Lily said, "I know that." She said, "I also know that you had other options, and you chose that one." She said, "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here because Grandpa kept that receipt in a tin on his shelf for 20 years, and he raised me for 4 of them, and he never once said a word about it. And I think you should know that. I think you should know what kind of man you have for a father." Marcus put his face in his hands. His shoulders did the thing Walter had felt at the car after Eleanor's funeral. The thing that means a man is trying not to come apart in a visible way. Sandra stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed and her eyes on the table, and said nothing. Lily sat across from her father, and did not look away, and did not speak. She gave him the silence he needed, the way Walter had given her the silence she needed, at the kitchen table that morning. She let it run until he was ready. Then Marcus looked up. His eyes were red at the edges. He said, "I need to talk to him." Lily said, "I know." She picked up the receipt and put it back in the tin, and pressed the lid down and put the tin in her bag. She stood up. She said, "I'll tell him to expect you." She drove back to Ohio. She arrived at 9:12 in the evening and came directly to the workshop, where I was still at the bench under the lamp, working on a carriage clock that had come in that week, with a bent fourth wheel. She sat on the stool and set her bag on the floor, and was quiet for a moment. The grandfather clock ticked. The carriage clock lay in pieces on the felt mat under the lamp. She said, "He's coming." I said, "When?" She said, "Soon." He didn't say exactly. He just said he needed to come. I put down the watch tool I was holding. I looked at the pieces of the carriage clock laid out in order on the felt, each component removed in sequence and placed precisely so that the reassembly would follow the disassembly in reverse, the way it always should, the way every repair begins, with understanding the order in which things came apart. I said, "That's good." Lily said, "Are you all right?" I thought about this. Not the answer. The truth of the question. Was I all right? The carriage clock lay in pieces on the mat. The grandfather clock ticked behind me. The Waldman lamp made its small circle of light on the bench, and the workshop held around it the particular quiet of a place where things are in the middle of being repaired. Always in the middle. That is the nature of a workshop. There is always something open on the bench. I said, "I have been all right for 20 years. I said, "I expect I will continue to be." Lily picked up her bag. She kissed the top of my head, a thing she had done since she was 4 years old, standing on the bottom rung of the stool to reach, and went into the house. I looked at the carriage clock pieces on the mat. Then I picked up the tweezers and began the reassembly. Marcus arrived on a Saturday morning, 3 days after Lily's visit to Columbus. He did not call first. He simply appeared at the workshop door at 9:24 in the morning. I know the time, because I looked at the Seth Thomas regulator on the wall when I heard the knock, the way a clockmaker looks at a clock when anything time-adjacent happens, which is to say, always. He was wearing a jacket I did not recognize. He had aged in the way men who carry things age, not in the face exactly, but in the posture, in the way he held himself slightly forward, as if he had been leaning into something invisible for a long time. I said, "Come in." He came in and stood inside the door, and looked around the workshop the way people do when they have not been somewhere in a long time, checking what has changed, recalibrating against memory. The grandfather clock was against the far wall. The Waldman lamp was on the bench. The shelves held the same configuration of tins and labeled envelopes, though the specific movements had turned over many times in the years since he had last stood here. The spare stool was beside the bench where it had always been, where Lily sat, where Marcus himself had sat as a child, lasting approximately 4 minutes before the fidgeting started. I said, "Sit down." He sat on the stool differently from Lily, further forward, elbows on knees, the posture of a man uncertain whether to stay. Lily sits back. Lily is comfortable in the workshop in a way Marcus never was. Some people are built for the patience this kind of room requires. Some are not. This is not a failing. It is a characteristic, the way a mainspring with a particular temper will behave consistently under load. You work with what the material is. I waited. He said, "I don't have a prepared speech." I said, "Good." He said, "Sandra found out about the jewelry before the funeral. She went into your room when you sent us to get something from the car. She found the box. She looked up what things were worth on her phone." He paused. He said, I didn't know she'd done it until she told me the night before the funeral. He said, she came to me with numbers. She had written them down. What the bracelet was worth, what the ring was worth, what the locket was worth. She said it was sitting there doing nothing, and we were behind on 2 months of rent, and that Eleanor would have wanted us to be taken care of. He paused. He said, I said yes. I want to be clear about that. She asked me, and I said yes. He said that last part and stopped. He heard himself say it and stopped. I said nothing. I let the silence do what silence does. Marcus said, I knew it was wrong. He said, I knew it the moment I agreed and every moment after. When you called and asked about the jewelry, I had already practiced the lie. He paused. He said, I have thought about it every single day for 20 years. Not every hour, but every day. Something ordinary happens, and it's there. He put his face in his hands. Not theatrically. The way a man does it when he is tired of holding his face in place. I did not go to him. I let him have the moment without interference. The way you let a mechanism run through its fault, so you can observe the full pattern before you intervene. This is not coldness. It is the understanding that some things must complete their own movement before anything useful can be done with them. After a while, Marcus took his hands from his face. He looked at me, eyes red at the edges, the same as Lily had described. He looked, at 42, like a man who has been carrying something heavy for 20 years and has just been told he can set it down, but does not yet know how to do that without falling forward. I got up from the bench. I went to the shelf. That morning I had placed 2 things where the tin used to sit. The receipt, which Lily had returned the previous evening. She had come by and left it on the bench without knocking, the way you leave something for a person when you know they need it back. And a small gold locket I had bought 5 years ago at a jeweler in town. Plain, oval, 14 karat, simple clasp. Inside it, a photograph of Eleanor at 35, standing in the kitchen with her coffee cup, laughing at something I had said that I can no longer remember. I had cut it from a larger photograph and fitted it to the locket myself, over the course of an afternoon in November 5 years ago, because certain things should exist in the world, regardless of who had taken the originals. I set both items on the workbench under the lamp, the receipt on the left, the locket on the right. I said, these 2 things weigh approximately the same. I picked up the receipt. I said, this one cost 3 women their jewelry, and your father 20 years of knowing what you did. I set it down. I picked up the locket. I said, this one cost me $47 and an afternoon. I set it down. I said, Lily wears it every day. She takes it off when she swims, 3 times a week at the college pool, and she puts it on the locker rim, and she puts it back on when she is done. She has never left it behind. I know this because she tells me things. Marcus looked at the locket. His hands were on his knees, and they were still. The stillness of a man who has run out of the energy that performing composure requires. He said, I'm sorry, quietly, not as a request for anything. As a fact he was stating. I said, I know. He said, what do I do? I said, you take the locket. You bring it to Lily, and give it to her yourself, and tell her where it came from and why. Not the story you've been telling yourself for 20 years. The true one. Marcus reached out and picked up the locket. He held it in his palm the way people hold small things when they are not certain of their own steadiness. He opened it, and looked at Eleanor at 35, laughing in the kitchen. He was quiet for a long time. I let the silence run. Then I said, she would have forgiven you 20 years ago. She would have been furious, and then she would have forgiven you, because that is who she was. I said, I cannot speak for Eleanor, but I am telling you what I know after 31 years. Marcus said, why didn't you ever say anything? To me, all this time. I said, because I needed to understand what the right tool was, before I picked one up. I said, it turned out the right tool was 19 years old, and had her grandmother's eyes. Some repairs you cannot do yourself. He sat a while longer. We did not speak. The grandfather clock ticked. The mantel clock on the second shelf answered it at its own interval. Eventually Marcus stood up. He was still holding the locket. He said, "Thank you, Dad." I said, "Go see your daughter." He left. I listened to his car pull away. Then I went to the bench and looked at the receipt lying by itself under the lamp. Pearl bracelet, $480. Gold locket, $620. Sapphire ring, $900. Total paid to customer, $2,000. I folded it along the watchmaker's crease. I placed it in the tin. I put the tin in the drawer under the bench. Not the shelf, the drawer, the closed drawer, the place for things that have finished their purpose and are now simply part of the record. Then I went inside and made coffee. 3 days later, Marcus and Lily drove out together. She had called him, apparently, which I had not expected. And the three of us sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. At the end of the 2 hours, Lily went to make a second round of coffee, and Marcus and I sat alone at the table. The kitchen was quiet. The clock ticked below. Marcus had both hands around his coffee cup, not the one-handed carelessness of a man who has never broken anything, but both hands, the posture of needing something to hold. He said, "They really were just things. To me, at the time." He said it quietly, not defensively, as a fact about who he was at 22. I looked at him across the table. Then I reached into my shirt pocket and placed the original gold locket on the table between us. Eleanor's locket, the one on the receipt, the one worth $620 at County Pawn and Exchange. I will tell you plainly, 6 months after finding the receipt, I had driven to 1147 Route 40 East and walked into County Pawn and Exchange and described the 3 items to the owner. The bracelet and ring were gone, sold within a week. The locket remained. It had sat in the case for 6 months without selling, for reasons the owner could not explain. I bought it back for $800. I could see Eleanor's engraving on the back without the loop, a small E in a circle, the engraver's finest point, barely visible, exactly as it had been. I put it in the tin, below the receipt. It had waited there for 20 years. Lily had not seen it when she found the tin. She had stopped at the receipt. The locket had waited, as things wait in tins, for the right moment. Marcus looked at it on the table without touching it. His jaw tightened once and released. I let the silence stretch. Then I said, "You told me things don't last forever." I said it quietly, not as accusation, as reference. A sentence from 20 years ago, from a man of 22 with his shoulders forward, and his voice rehearsed flat. Marcus looked at the locket. He said nothing. I picked it up, held it the way I hold a movement I have just finished repairing, before handing it to its owner. The weight of a small thing brought back from where it should not have been. I said, "You were right. Things don't last forever." I let the sentence sit alone. Then I said, "But some of them outlast us anyway." I set the locket on the table in front of Marcus. I looked at him, my son, 42, holding his coffee cup in both hands, with his mother's jaw and 20 years of something finally sitting outside of him on a kitchen table in Ohio. I said, "Give this to Lily, the original. Tell her where it came from. Tell her the whole true story. She can wear them both, or she can choose, or she can keep this one differently. That decision belongs to her." Marcus picked up the locket. He cupped both hands around it, the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. Then he closed his hands. He said, "Okay." Lily came back with 2 cups of coffee. She looked at Marcus, then at me. She set the cups down. I said, "Your father has something for you." Marcus opened his hands. He held the locket out to Lily. He told her what it was, and where it had been, and where it had come from before the tin. He told her as much of the true story as he knew. She listened. She looked at the locket in his palms for a long moment. Then she took it. She held it up to the October window light, that level, honest light, and looked at the engraving on the back. the small E inside a circle. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, she would have liked knowing it came back. I said, she would have. The clock ticked below. The afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor in its slow October way, the particular low angle that comes in sideways at this time of year and shows you things. Marcus held his coffee cup in both hands. Lily held the locket in both hands and looked at it, and then put it on. The original, Eleanor's, the E in a circle pressed against the base of her throat below the new one, both of them there. She did not say anything about wearing them both. She simply put it on, the way you put on something that belongs to you without needing to announce that it does. I drank my coffee. I looked at my family at the kitchen table. I said nothing else. Some moments are worth more kept than explained. I want to tell you what 20 years actually looks like. Not the summary version. Not 6,000 mornings reduced to a single sentence the way you reduce a long repair to a line in the log. I want to tell you what it looks like from inside the days themselves. Because the 20 years between the receipt going into the tin and Lily finding it is not a gap in the story. It is the story. It is the part where a man decides, one ordinary morning at a time, who he is going to be, in the aftermath of something that could have broken him. I got up every morning at 6:15. I made coffee. I put Eleanor's cup in the rack with the handle facing left until the 3rd year, when I finally moved it to the cabinet on a Tuesday morning in February, without deciding in advance that I was going to do it. I stood at the counter for a moment after. Then I finished my coffee and went to the workshop. That is what 20 years looks like on the outside. On the inside it is more complicated, and I will try to give it to you accurately, because accuracy is what the story deserves. In the 1st year, I worked harder than I had worked in any of the 37 years before it. I took every job that came in. I stayed at the bench until 9 and sometimes 10 in the evening, under the Waldman lamp, in the particular silence of a workshop, where the only sounds are the clocks and the small, precise sounds of the tools. This was not grief management in any therapeutic sense. This was simply the understanding that the bench was the one place in the world where I knew exactly what I was doing and why, and the house outside the workshop door was the one place in the world where I did not. So I stayed at the bench. I worked. I let the clocks tell the time so I did not have to. The 2nd year was quieter. Not easier, quieter. The 1st year has a kind of momentum to it, a driven quality, the forward motion of a man who is afraid of what happens if he stops. The 2nd year the momentum fades, and you find out what is underneath it. What was underneath it, for me, was the workshop, and the clocks, and the bench lamp, and the tin on the shelf, and the slow particular work of continuing to be a person who does his job correctly. I repaired 31 movements in the 2nd year. I have the log. I kept a repair log for 38 years. Every movement that came to the bench, what was wrong with it, what I did, how long it took, what it cost. The 2nd year's log looks exactly like the 1st year's log, and the year before Eleanor got sick, and the year before that. The log does not record the condition of the man holding the tools. It records the condition of the things he repaired. Every entry says, received, examined, fault identified, repaired, returned running correctly. Every entry, for 38 years. That is the log of a life, if you know how to read it. I kept the tin on the shelf through the 2nd year, and the 3rd, and the 4th. I did not open it. I did not need to open it. I knew what was in it. The knowledge of what was in it was a permanent feature of the workshop, the way the grandfather clock was a permanent feature, present, ticking in its own way, requiring no particular attention, but never entirely outside my awareness. Marcus called on a regular basis, every 2 weeks in the 1st year, approximately once a month after that, settling eventually into the pattern of a dutiful son who calls when he remembers, and sometimes when he does not forget. He called on my birthday. He called at Christmas. He called in April, which I believe was not entirely coincidental. I believe some part of Marcus always knew what April meant to me, And the call in April was the closest he came, for many years, to acknowledging it. We talked about ordinary things. His job, the weather in Columbus, whether I had seen the game, which I had not, because I have never followed sports with any consistency. He did not mention the jewelry. I did not mention the jewelry. We spoke to each other across a distance that neither of us named. Sandra did not call. I did not expect her to. In the 5th year, I drove to 1147 Route 40 East. I want to give you this moment carefully, because it matters to the story in a way that I did not fully appreciate until much later. I drove to County Pawn and Exchange on a Thursday morning in September, 5 years after the funeral, and I walked in and described the 3 items to a man behind the counter who had the careful eyes of someone who has spent a long time looking at things people bring in and assessing their value without sentiment. I described the bracelet. I described the ring. I described the locket. 18-karat gold, oval, plain, with an engraving on the back. A small E and a circle. The engraver's finest point. He told me the bracelet and ring were gone, sold within a week of the transaction, which was the week after Eleanor's funeral, which was the week my son took them there. Pearl and sapphire move quickly, he said. Good pieces at fair prices, he said. The locket he still had. He could not explain why. It was good gold. It was fairly priced. It had sat in the case for 5 years and nobody had bought it. He showed it to me. I looked at it through the glass first, without touching it, the way you look at a movement through the case before you decide to open it. Then he lifted it out and set it on the counter, and I picked it up. The E in a circle was on the back. I did not need the loop. I had paid for that engraving myself in 1986, at a jeweler 3 towns over, as an anniversary gift, and I knew the weight and the feel of it, the way I know the weight and feel of every movement I have spent time with. Some things your hands remember independently of your mind. I paid $800 for it. He had marked it up slightly in 5 years, which was reasonable, and I paid without comment, because the arithmetic of that moment was not something I was interested in examining closely. I put it in my jacket pocket. I drove home. I went to the workshop and took the tin off the shelf, and opened it, and placed the locket inside, below the receipt, and pressed the lid down. Then I put the tin back on the shelf. I did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. Eleanor was gone. Marcus did not know I had gone to Route 40 East, and I was not ready to tell him, and I did not know when or whether I would be. Lily was 6 years old and living in Columbus and had no context for any of it. I was alone in the workshop with the tin on the shelf and the locket inside it, and the knowledge that Eleanor's initial was back in the room where it belonged. That was enough. For that day, that was enough. I want to tell you about the years Lily was here, because they were the years that mattered most inside the 20, and because I have not given them their full weight yet. She arrived in April, the cruelest month, as far as I am concerned, though Lily has always been its best argument. She was 3 years old. She fit into the house the way a small mechanism fits into a case that was made for it. Not without adjustment, not without some rearranging of the interior components to make room, but correctly, in a way that felt less like addition and more like completion. The house had been running without certain parts since Eleanor died. Lily's arrival did not replace those parts, but she added her own, and the mechanism ran differently with her in it. Better, in the ways that mattered. She slept in the spare room under the quilt Eleanor had made in 1989, a blue and white pattern, simple squares, the kind of quilt that is not remarkable to look at, but is exactly right to sleep under. I do not know whether Lily knew the quilt was Eleanor's. I did not tell her. She pulled it up to her chin every night, with the specific satisfaction of a child who has found the thing that is exactly right, and that was sufficient information for both of us. She sat on the stool in the workshop from her 2nd week in the house. Not every day. She had her own occupations, the serious and absorbing occupations of a 3-year-old, which included a great deal of activity with a set of wooden blocks and a relationship with a stuffed bear named, for reasons she never explained to me, Gerald. But she came to the workshop regularly, and she sat on the stool, and she watched me work with the patient attention that I recognized as Eleanor's, and that I did not comment on, because some things are worth more observed than named. At 3, she watched. At 4, she asked questions. Good questions. The specific kind that tell you a child is actually looking at what is in front of them, rather than performing curiosity. She asked why the clock had 2 hands, and the watch had 3. She asked what the smallest part was. She asked whether broken things were sad. I said, "The broken things don't know they're broken. Only the clockmaker knows." She thought about this. She said, "Are you the clockmaker?" I said, "I am." She said, "So you know when things are broken?" I said, "I do." She considered this for a moment with Eleanor's considering expression, the slight tilt of the head, the eyes focused on something slightly past the surface of what she was looking at. Then she picked up Gerald and went back to the house, apparently satisfied. I went back to the movement on the bench. Those 4 years are a country I return to regularly, not with grief, with the specific warmth of a place you have visited and know you will not visit again in exactly the same form, but that stays available to you as a reference point. On the mornings I needed to remember what it was like to have the house running correctly, I went to those 4 years. I thought about Lily at the kitchen table, with the wooden clock face. I thought about Gerald on the stool. I thought about the blue and white quilt pulled up to a small chin. The tin was on the shelf through all of it. The locket was in the tin. Eleanor's initial was in the room, below the receipt, kept. Some things you keep because you do not know yet what you will do with them. Some things you keep because you know exactly what you will do with them, and you are waiting for the conditions that will allow you to do it. By the time Lily was 7 and went back to Columbus, I knew which category the tin belonged to. I did not know the conditions yet, but I knew the category. And a clockmaker who knows the category of a part can wait as long as the job requires. 11 more years. The clocks ticked. The bench lamp made its circle of light. The tin sat on the shelf. I got up every morning at 6:15. I made coffee. I went to the bench. I worked on whatever needed working on. I kept the house. I kept the workshop. I kept the record. Some mechanisms outlast the people who wound them. Eleanor outlasted the receipt. She outlasted the empty jewelry box. She outlasted the 20 years of March mornings when I woke up, and the first thing I thought about was the specific quality of the light at 6:47 on the Wednesday she died, and the watch I looked at because it was the thing my hands did. She outlasted all of it. She was in the workshop with me every morning. She was in the quilt in the spare room. She was in the waltz that the jewelry box played into the empty bedroom. She was in Lily's eyes, and Lily's silence, and Lily's way of holding her coffee cup in both hands on a cold morning. 20 years. She outlasted every single day of them. I knew she would. Eleanor Margaret Howell was born in 1952 in a small town in eastern Ohio, the second of 3 daughters, of a man who repaired radios and a woman who taught piano to the neighborhood children for 25 cents a lesson. She grew up in a house full of things being fixed and things being played, which is perhaps why she had no difficulty, later, with a husband who spent his days in a workshop. She understood the grammar of repair. She understood that a thing being worked on is not a broken thing. It is a thing in the process of becoming itself again. She was 28 when I met her. I was 29. This was at a church function that I attended because my mother insisted, and that Eleanor attended because her friend had a performance anxiety about going alone. She was standing near the coffee table, holding a cup in both hands, and looking at the room with the expression of a person who is interested in what she is seeing, without particularly needing to participate in it. I recognized the expression. It was the expression of a person comfortable with observing. We were married 14 months later. Eleanor was specific. I have said this before, and I will say it again, because it is the most important thing, and the thing most likely to be lost in the telling. She had opinions about the correct temperature for bread dough, and the correct angle for a reading lamp. She knew what she thought. She had done the work of finding out. She read in the armchair by the east window, with her face in her left hand, the lamplight coming over her shoulder. She hummed when she was happy. 8 bars of a waltz, always the same waltz, never knowing she was doing it. I heard it every morning in the kitchen for 31 years. I heard it so many times that I stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing a clock, until the morning I walked into the kitchen 3 weeks after she died, and the silence where it had been was the loudest thing in the room. She was not easy. I want to be honest about this, because the tendency when a person is gone is to smooth them into someone easier than they were, and Eleanor does not deserve that smoothing. She was demanding and precise, and she did not apologize for having standards. But she was never unfair. I cannot remember a single instance, in 31 years, of Eleanor being unfair. She would have known immediately what Marcus had done. She would have been furious. She would have driven to Columbus and said precisely what needed to be said. And then, I know this as certainly as I know the weight of a pocket watch in my palm, she would have forgiven him. Not quickly, not without cost, but she would have gotten there. Because Eleanor understood that people were not their worst moments, even when their worst moments were very bad. She outlasted the worst thing Marcus did. She outlasted the 20 years. She was in the workshop every morning, and she is in the workshop still, in the quilt in the spare room, in the waltz in the jewelry box, in the eyes of a 19-year-old girl who holds her coffee cup in both hands on cold mornings and tilts her head slightly to the right when she is listening to something worth hearing. Eleanor, she was worth knowing. I was lucky to know her for 31 years, 4 months, and 17 days, and I have been carrying that luck ever since. I want to pause here for a moment before I tell you the rest. Not because the story needs a pause, because you do. You have been with me through the funeral, and the empty jewelry box, and the waltz playing into the empty room, and the receipt under the lamp, and 20 years of mornings at the bench, and a 19-year-old girl, with her grandmother's eyes, finding a tin in a spare room, and a man finally saying out loud what he had known for 20 years. You have been carrying all of that alongside me. I know you have, because you are still here, and the people who were not carrying it would have stopped by now. There is a particular kind of person who watches a story like this one, not for entertainment, because something in it is true to something they have lived, and seeing it named, even in someone else's story, does something that nothing else quite does. It tells you that you are not the only one. You are not the only one who kept the receipt in the tin. You are not the only one who got up every morning and went to the bench and worked on whatever needed working on. You are not the only one who carried something quietly for longer than anyone around you knew, waiting for the conditions that would allow you to do something useful with what you were holding. There are more of us than any of us realized. If this story has found something in you that you recognize, hit the like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I have heard from people in places I have never been, who have held tins of their own for years longer than mine, and every one of those comments is a reminder that this particular kind of carrying is not unique to one man in one workshop in Ohio. It is the oldest kind of carrying there is, and it does not last forever, but it outlasts considerably more than you think it will when you first pick it up. Now, let me tell you the rest. The part I have not yet given you in full is the part that matters most, not the discovery, not the confrontation, not the mirror line delivered quietly across a kitchen table. The part that matters most is the workshop. A man sitting at a bench under a lamp for 20 years, with a tin on the shelf, choosing every single morning to be the kind of person who keeps the record correctly and holds the thing in reserve until the mechanism arrives that makes it useful. That is the reversal. Not the dramatic moment, the 20 years of ordinary mornings that made the dramatic moment possible. A clockmaker learns early that the movement does not care about the case. The case is what people see. The movement is what actually keeps time. What happened in the workshop over 20 years was the movement. What happened at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon was the case. Visible, satisfying, the thing that shows you what was running inside all along. I kept the movement running. That is all I want you to take from the 20 years. Not patience as a virtue, not restraint as a lesson. Just the plain fact of a man at a bench, one morning at a time, for as long as the job required. Let me take you to the workshop for the last time. The workshop on a Saturday morning in October has a particular quality that no other room in the house has, and that no other time of week in the workshop has. The light comes in through the east window at an angle that is specific to this season and this hour. Not the flat summer light that fills the room evenly, not the gray winter light that makes everything look like it is waiting for something, but the October morning light, low and amber-edged, that comes in sideways and catches the dust motes and the brass of the clock faces and the oil on the tools and makes the room look, for approximately 40 minutes, starting at around 8:30, like something you would want to preserve. I have worked in this room for 38 years. I have seen that light approximately 2,000 times. I do not take it for granted. That is one of the things that 38 years at a bench teaches you, that the light through the window at 8:30 on an October morning is not a small thing. It is what the day is made of. The clocks on the shelves and the bench lamp, and the smell of machine oil and old wood, and the slow particular silence of a room full of things that keep time. These are not the background of the work. These are the work. The bench is where I have spent the better part of my life. And on the morning my son came to apologize for something he had done 20 years before, I was exactly where I always am. That felt correct. I was at the bench when Marcus arrived. I had been there since 7. I was working on the Hamilton 992B, the same movement I had been working on the morning Lily brought me coffee and asked her questions, the morning 3 days before she found the tin. The mainspring was in better condition than I had initially assessed. That happens sometimes. You open something expecting the worst, and find that the damage is more manageable than the presentation suggested. The mechanism is not as far gone as it looked from the outside. I had been thinking about mainsprings. Marcus knocked at 9:24. I knew it was him. Not because I had been expecting him at that particular minute, I had not, but because the knock had a quality I recognized, the restrained knock of a man who is not certain of his welcome, and is expressing this uncertainty in the amount of force he applies to the door. Marcus has always knocked that way. Even as a child, coming to the workshop door, his knock said, "I am not sure whether now is a good time." It said this even when it was always a good time. It said it on the morning he arrived, to tell me he and Sandra were engaged. It said it on the morning he arrived 2 years after that, to ask if I could take Lily. Some habits of approach are set early, and do not change. The way a mainspring that has been wound to a particular tension long enough will hold that set even when released. I said, "Come in." He came in. I have already told you what his posture said, and what the stool looked like with him on it, and what his hands did when he talked. I want to tell you something different now, something I noticed and did not report the first time through, because the first time through, I was giving you the events, and now I want to give you what was underneath them. What I noticed when Marcus sat on the stool was that he looked like a man who had not slept. Not the dramatic sleeplessness of a crisis, the practical sleeplessness of someone who lay in the dark for several hours, thinking about what they were going to say in the morning, and said none of it because none of it was right. His eyes had that particular quality. His hands, when they were not in motion, settled on his knees with the heaviness of hands that have been clenched and unclenched through a long night. He was 42 years old, and he looked it in a way that he had not always looked it. 20 years of daily knowing will do that to a face. I want to tell you also what I was feeling, sitting at the bench across from my son on that October morning, because I have been careful throughout this story to give you the observations without the interior, and I think by now you have earned the interior. I was not angry. I want to be precise about this. Not because the anger had been resolved or processed or otherwise managed. I am not a man who manages emotions the way some people manage emotions, which is to say, I do not. The anger was there. It had been there for 20 years. But anger is like a mainspring. It does not simply discharge, it converts. 20 years of anger, in a man who goes to his bench every morning and does his work, converts into something else, into precision, into patience, into the specific quality of attention I brought to Marcus sitting on the stool across from me, which was the same quality I brought to a movement under the lamp, complete, steady, without the distortion that heat introduces. I was not performing calm. I was calm, the way a workshop is calm, not because nothing is happening inside it, but because everything that is happening inside it is ordered and purposeful and pointed toward making something run correctly again. Marcus said, I don't have a prepared speech. I said, good. I said good, because prepared speeches are the enemy of true things, and I had been waiting 20 years for a true thing from Marcus on this subject, and I was not interested in anything less. He told me about Sandra, and the jewelry box, and the night before the funeral, and the numbers she had written down. He told me he had said yes. He said, I want to be clear about that. She asked me, and I said yes. This was the truest thing he said in the first part of the conversation, and I registered it, the way I register the moment, in a diagnostic, when a mechanism reveals its actual fault, rather than the one it appeared to have. The actual fault was not Sandra. Sandra was the ignition. Marcus was the mechanism that fired. He had said yes. He put his face in his hands when he had said as much of it as he could say at that point. I watched his shoulders and I watched his hands, and I let the silence run the way I let silence run in the workshop, when a mechanism is in the middle of something, without interference, without hurry, without the assumption that the silence needs to end before it has done what silence does. The grandfather clock ticked. 1 second, 1 second, 1 second. The mantel clock on the second shelf counted its own interval. The morning light moved across the bench in its slow way, catching the brass of the Hamilton case, and the polished wood of the loop handle, and the edge of the Waldman lamp. The workshop held around us, steady and quiet, and full of things that were in the process of being repaired. When Marcus took his hands from his face, I was already at the shelf. I had placed the 2 items there that morning before he arrived, the receipt and the new locket. I set them on the bench under the lamp. I told him what they weighed and what they cost. I told him about Lily wearing the locket. I told him what I wanted him to do. Then I told him about Eleanor. I said, she would have forgiven you 20 years ago. I said it without softening it and without ornamenting it, because it was a plain fact, and plain facts do not need ornament. She would have been furious, and she would have forgiven him, because that is the particular arithmetic of a woman who understood that people were more than the worst thing they had done. I knew this. I had 31 years of evidence for it. I said, I cannot speak for Eleanor, but I am telling you what I know. Marcus sat with this. He sat with it the way Lily sits with things, not avoiding it, not rushing through it, just holding it in the full weight of it, until the weight became something he could carry differently than he had been carrying it. He said, why didn't you ever say anything, all this time? I said, because I needed to understand what the right tool was before I picked one up. I said, it turned out the right tool was 19 years old and had her grandmother's eyes, some repairs you cannot do yourself. He sat on the stool for another few minutes. The clocks ticked. The light continued its slow move across the bench. Marcus held the new locket in his closed fist. The one I had bought for $47. The one with Eleanor at 35 laughing in the kitchen. The one Lily wore every day. And I watched him hold it and thought about mainsprings. About the specific kind of damage that comes from being wound too tightly for too long. About the difference between a spring that has fatigued past repair and a spring that simply needs to be relieved of tension and reset, carefully, by someone who knows what they are doing. A mainspring that has been wound too tight for too long is not broken. It remembers the wrong tension. It needs time, and the right hands, and the understanding that the reset will not happen in a single session. It will happen in increments. The mechanism will not run correctly on the first day after the repair, but it will run, and over time, if the work is done correctly and the tension is maintained at the right level, it will run the way it was designed to run. Marcus eventually stood up. He said, "Thank you, Dad." I said, "Go see your daughter." He left. His car started. It pulled away from the front of the house. I sat at the bench for 11 minutes by the sweep hand of the Hamilton, and then I took the receipt from the bench, and I folded it along the watchmaker's crease, for the last time, and I placed it in the tin, and I put the tin in the drawer, where finished things go. Then I went inside and made coffee. 3 days later, he and Lily came together, and I delivered the mirror line at the kitchen table with Eleanor's original locket between us. And Marcus picked it up and gave it to Lily, and told her the true story. And Lily held it to the window light, and looked at the small E, in a circle on the back, and put it on alongside the new one, without saying anything about wearing them both, because she did not need to. She simply put it on, the way you put on something that was always meant to be yours. I said, "You were right. Things don't last forever." A pause, the length of a breath. Then, "But some of them outlast us anyway." That is the reversal. That is the mirror line. That is 20 years of a man at a bench converted, in 2 sentences and a kitchen table in October, into something that will run correctly for a very long time. The clock ticked below. The movement was running. The workshop in late afternoon has a different quality from the workshop in the morning. The morning light comes in through the east window and is honest and direct and shows you everything plainly. The afternoon light comes in low from the west, warm and long, with a quality of completion, not ending exactly, but the particular settling that happens when a day has done what it came to do. It is a Thursday afternoon in November, 3 weeks after Marcus and Lily sat at my kitchen table, and the locket changed hands, and the tin went into the drawer. The grandfather clock ticks against the far wall. The Hamilton 992B is finished, and wrapped, and ready to collect. There is a bracket clock from the 1880s open on the bench that will take another week. There is always something open on the bench. There always will be. I am holding Eleanor's jewelry box. I picked it up from the shelf 20 minutes ago, and I have been standing here with it in both hands, feeling the weight of it. The mahogany, the brass hinge, the small music mechanism inside the lid, the 3 remaining pieces of jewelry on the velvet. The pieces that remained because they had no obvious market value, to an eye looking for obvious market value. The pieces that remained because the person who took the others did not understand what they were looking at. They are Eleanor's too. They are not lesser for having been left behind. I press my thumb under the clasp. The lid swings back. 8 bars of a waltz play into the quiet workshop. I stand there and let it play. The grandfather clock ticks. The afternoon light comes through the west window and catches the brass of the lamp and the edge of the mahogany and the small paste stones of the dragonfly brooch and makes them all, briefly, the same warm color. The waltz finishes. The mechanism stills. I close the lid. I have been a clockmaker for 38 years. I have spent those years in the company of mechanisms, things that run, things that stop, things that can be repaired, and things that cannot. I have learned that the most important thing about a mechanism is not whether it is currently running. The most important thing is whether the movement is sound. A sound movement can be stopped and started, and repaired, and handed, from one careful set of hands to another, across 100 years, and still be made to keep correct time. Eleanor's movement was sound. It was sound before I met her, and it was sound for 31 years in my company, and it was sound on the morning she died, and it has been sound every day since. The things Marcus took were the case. The case has been replaced. A locket for $47. A photograph of a woman laughing in a kitchen. A granddaughter who wears it every day and removes it only to swim, and puts it back on when she is done, without thinking, because that is what you do with something that belongs to you. The movement is irreplaceable. The movement is in the workshop every morning. It is in the spare room in the blue and white quilt. It is in the eyes of a 19-year-old girl who tilts her head slightly to the right when she is listening to something worth hearing. This is what I know about time, after 38 years of being responsible for whether it runs correctly. Time does not care about the case. Time runs in the movement, and the movement, if it is sound, if it was built correctly, outlasts everything they try to take from it, or sell at the county pawn and exchange on Route 40 East, 4 days after a funeral. Lily sent me a photograph last week. She is standing outside a building on her college campus in October light, laughing at something outside the frame, and both lockets are visible at the base of her throat. The new and the old, side by side. She does not know I look at that photograph more than is perhaps reasonable. Some observations belong in the tin. I place the jewelry box back on the shelf. I adjust it slightly, so that it sits in the center of the rectangle of slightly less faded wood, where it has rested for more than 3 decades. First on the bedroom dresser, now here on the workshop shelf, still in the room where it belongs. I step back. I look at it in the afternoon light. The waltz is in there. 8 bars of it, wound into the small cylinder and comb movement inside the lid, ready to play the next time someone presses their thumb under the clasp. It will play for anyone. It does not require that you knew the woman who hummed it in the kitchen. It simply plays, the way it has always played, into whatever room it finds itself in. A clockmaker's job is to keep things running. Some mechanisms outlast the people who wound them. Eleanor outlasted everything they tried to take from her. She always will. If this story has stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. And if you are carrying something quietly right now, a receipt in a tin, a knowledge you have not yet found the right moment for, a silence longer than anyone around you knows, I want you to know one thing. The right moment exists. Some parts wait years to find the right mechanism. That is not loss. That is patience. The thing you are holding in reserve will do exactly what it was always meant to do, when the conditions arrive that allow it to. Keep the record. Do the work. Hold the part. The mechanism will come.